Logan Hayes was not the kind of man who talked about how he felt. He spoke in load calculations and tolerances, in the particular silence that only arrived after long honest hours of work. When Eleanor Voss walked into the main conference room for the very first time, Logan looked at her exactly once and went back to his numbers. He already had enough to carry. And then one evening, in a corridor lit by a particular quiet, he made a small offhand joke. And the woman who ran the entire operation turned and said 7 words that changed everything. Her answer was only 7 words long, but they were enough to change everything he had ever been certain of. Logan had been on site since 6 that morning. The 18th floor of Meridian Tower was still open at its edges, raw and cold, the wind cutting through the open structural frame with the particular sound that most people found unpleasant and that Logan had always found clarifying. He moved through the space without performance or self-consciousness, crouching to examine weld seams, pressing his palm flat against steel connection that most of the project managers who wore hard hats for site photographs would never think to physically touch. His hands were wide and marked at the knuckles in the permanent way that comes from years of actual manual contact with actual materials, traces of grease and iron oxide that appeared regardless of whatever else he was wearing. He was 35 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair he kept short, and a quality of contained stillness that some people read as coldness, and that others, given enough time in the same space, eventually understood was simply the complete absence of wasted motion. His name appeared on 5 successfully completed structural projects across the greater Chicago area over the preceding decade. Every one of them delivered on schedule, everyone signed off without incident. It also appeared as of 3 weeks ago, on a private set of notes he was keeping about a financial anomaly he had noticed while comparing materials invoices against procurement cost reports. A discrepancy that was consistent across 7 consecutive billing cycles, and that had, to his experienced eye, the geometry of intention rather than the geometry of error. His phone rang at 8:47. Grace Bennett, internal accounts reconciliation, second oldest friendship he had in the city. All hands meeting at 9. New CEO is doing her own introduction. Logan looked out at the street 38 floors below, yellow cabs, morning pedestrians, the city beginning its workday with complete indifference. Is she coming to the site? A brief pause. No one has thought to ask her that yet. He put the phone away and went to find the elevator. The conference room had been designed in the way that conference rooms in buildings like this one are always designed, to make the people inside feel that they are being assessed from above. 32 seats around a long oval table, floor-to-ceiling glass on the north and east sides, recessed overhead lighting that removed every comfortable shadow from the room. Logan arrived with several minutes to spare and took the seat nearest the exit. Around him, colleagues who had been with the company anywhere from 2 years to 15 settled themselves with the particular managed stiffness of people who have been told something consequential is approaching, folders aligned, postures corrected, eyes moved to the doorway at intervals. Eleanor Voss arrived at exactly 9, without a prepared statement in her hands and without the calibrated, professionally warm smile that most people in her position used as a first instrument in rooms exactly like this one. She was 33 years old and had taken over Meridian from her father 8 months earlier, under circumstances that the company's informal information network had been working to resolve into a satisfying narrative ever since, never quite successfully. She wore a black dress with a V-neck and clean lines, and her only visible jewelry was a thin silver chain at the base of her throat. No rings on either hand, no prominent watch. Her hair was the color of dark chestnuts and she wore it down, and she looked at every single person in that room with the systematic, unhurried attention of a structural engineer examining a bridge for the first time. Not admiring it, not dismissing it, simply reading what was actually there before deciding what it needed from her. The 2 senior project managers delivered their quarterly summaries in the careful, slightly softened language of men experienced at presenting difficult numbers as managed process. When Logan's turn came, he placed his actual figures on the table without preamble or apology. 11% behind on materials delivery. 2 of the 4 contracted sub-teams running behind schedule on their sequencing. Root cause. Approval bottlenecks within the internal procurement chain that had nothing to do with the performance of any field team. He stated it the way he would state a load rating, as information, available and neutral, without color or softening. Eleanor stopped him partway through his second data point. Mr. Hayes, her voice was even and precise, not unkind. If I wanted to know why we're behind, I would have read the report. I read every report before I walked into this building this morning. What I need from you is, what does this organization have to give you so that we are not behind next week? The room was silent in the specific way of people who are recalibrating very quickly. Logan looked at her for one measured second. Someone in procurement who can approve materials requisitions and actually read a technical drawing. The silence that followed was long enough to become its own event. Eleanor wrote something in the small notebook on the table in front of her. She did not smile. She gave no visible signal about how the answer had landed. In the far right corner of the table, Xavier Grant, CFO, 46 years old, silver-haired, carrying the particular polished ease of a man who had spent 20 years knowing exactly which conversations to occupy and which ones to redirect, drew his eyebrows together by a small fraction and said nothing at all. After the room cleared, Eleanor held Logan back for 8 minutes with direct questions about the timetable for floors 19 through 22. At one point, she referenced a specific subcontractor by name without glancing down at any document. She had read everything before she walked in. Logan noticed this. He said nothing about having noticed it. When he left and stood at the elevator, he stayed still for a beat longer than the elevator required and then stepped inside. That same evening, he drove to his daughter's school. Emma was 8 years old and had her mother's exact laugh, and she came out the front doors at a full run the way she always did, her backpack swinging wide. He crouched down on the sidewalk outside the school entrance without being asked and listened, while she told him about a disagreement over the rules of a game, the specific injustice of a new library checkout policy, and the comparative superiority of her table group's science project. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without dividing his attention elsewhere. In the car, she asked him, somewhere between the seatbelt and the search for her water bottle, whether he missed her mom. He took out his wallet, worn dark leather, thin from years of use, and opened it so she could see the photograph inside. A woman with light hair laughing at whoever was holding the camera, her expression entirely unguarded and entirely itself. "I miss everything," he said. He closed the wallet. He drove home. After Emma was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the files open in front of him. The numbers were still wrong in the same way they had been wrong for 7 consecutive cycles. That kind of consistency was not an accident. It was a structure. And structures, Logan understood better than most people, told you exactly what they were built to do if you looked at them long enough without looking away. 3 weeks had now passed since he first identified the discrepancy. He cross-referenced the materials invoices against the cost reports produced by internal accounting and confirmed a gap of just under 11% uniform across all 7 billing periods. He had checked it 4 times across 4 separate evenings, approaching it each time from a different angle, and the number was stable. He brought it to the head of the accounting team, who looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided a professional boundary has been crossed. "You're on the engineering side, Hayes. The books are our department's concern." Logan went to Grace instead. Grace looked at the same figures for a while without speaking, which was unusual for Grace, and her face changed the way a room changes when the primary light source moves. She turned the second page over, then turned it back. "This isn't new," she said, keeping her voice quiet and even. "Someone asked about something similar 18 months ago. They were reassigned within the week, different floor, different function. Nothing was ever filed." Logan absorbed this and asked one question. "Who signed the disbursement approvals on every anomalous cycle?" Grace pointed to the signature field in the approval records, running her finger down the column without a word. "Xavier Grant, every single one, consistent across all 7 cycles, as if the same hand had been making the same decision at regular intervals for the better part of a year." That evening, Logan copied everything to an external drive, stored it in the inside pocket of his jacket bag, and said nothing further about it at the office. He told no one, including Grace, that he had also begun keeping a separate written record in a notebook he kept at home. Not because he thought it would be needed, but because he had learned, in 6 years of structural work, that documentation was not something you assembled after the failure. You maintained it during the work, while the conditions were still observable, before the thing you were recording became history. The following Tuesday, Eleanor appeared at the construction site without any advance notice. No assistant, no meeting request, no slot on the project calendar. She took the white hard hat at the site entrance and put it on without a moment's pause. The way people who are genuinely interested in something put on the necessary equipment versus the way people who are performing interest put it on for the photograph and then take it off. Logan was the first one to see her. He walked over and said, "I'll walk you through." They went up through 3 floors of active construction without discussing company performance or organizational matters. She asked about the beam configuration on the upper floors and he explained it. The load distribution logic, the spacing rationale, the specific adjustments the actual soil composition of this site had required from the original design drawings. She asked questions that demonstrated she was building a real working model of the situation in her mind, not gathering material for a presentation. On the 19th floor, they stopped at an open window frame with a view out over the lake. The wind was strong and coming off the water, Eleanor said. Without framing or preparation, the board wants me to compress the safety verification phase by 6 weeks. They've described it as a scheduling realignment. Logan looked out at the lake. Then he said, "If you do that, the building gets delivered on time. And somewhere in the next decade, a weld that should have been identified and corrected in verification will fail under operational load." She was silent for long enough that the quality of the air between them shifted. Then, "Do you always tell people above you what they don't want to hear?" "Logan, only when they're worth the honesty." She turned and looked at him. It was the first time in everything that had passed between them that her face produced something that had not been prepared. The expression lasted 3 seconds, no more, and then it was gone. Down in the site manager's office on the ground floor, a security camera recorded them both standing at the window opening. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 9:41 in the morning. On the 28th floor of the main tower, Xavier Grant was watching the same feed from his desk. He noted the duration of the conversation and put nothing on paper. That same afternoon, Xavier stopped Logan in the corridor near the elevator banks. His entire manner was warmth and easy familiarity, the specific warmth of a man who has always had sufficient leverage that he has never been required to stop performing it. "Heard you gave Ms. Voss quite a tour this morning." Logan did not shift his weight. "Site inspection. Routine." Xavier placed a hand on Logan's shoulder for a moment. "Of course, just keep doing your job, Hayes. Don't let anything distract you from what actually matters." The hand came away, he walked on. The word distract carried something in the architecture of the sentence, something that could not be cited or formally reported, but that Logan registered the way he registered a failing joint before it became visible. Through the structural logic of the thing, not through any surface evidence. That evening, he made a second copy of every file he had accumulated and stored it in a different location. 2 days after that, Xavier sent a meeting request with no description in the subject line. When Logan arrived and sat down, Xavier closed the office door and placed a modified technical report on the desk between them. The document bore the same project header and section numbers as the genuine report Logan had filed 3 weeks earlier, but the contents had been altered. Load tolerances rounded upward by small amounts specifically calibrated to align with the materials budget Xavier had been quietly reducing, safety margins adjusted by fractions that would not immediately register as significant to anyone without detailed knowledge of the actual site conditions. Xavier explained, with the practiced warmth of a man who has had versions of this conversation before, that the adjusted figures reflected a higher-level decision that had already been made, and that Logan's signature was required purely as a technical formality confirming engineering awareness. Logan read through every page without hurrying. He read the first page twice. He set the report back on the desk and said, "I don't put my name on documents that misrepresent the actual load conditions on a building that people are going to occupy." Xavier kept his voice entirely reasonable. "This is a decision that benefits everyone, Logan. The organization, the project timeline, and frankly, your position here." Logan stood up. "The 22,000 people who are going to use that building benefit most from accurate numbers." He walked toward the door. Behind him, in a register just above the threshold of deniability, Xavier said, "You are in a position that is considerably easier to replace than you seem to appreciate, Hayes." Logan pushed through the door and kept walking without turning around. He went back to Grace that evening with everything he had accumulated. Grace had been working her own angle in the 2 weeks since their first conversation. She had found the company, Clearfield Subholdings, incorporated in Delaware 9 months and 3 weeks before the first Meridian disbursement arrived. 0 documented business activity, 0 public-facing operations. Its invoices to Meridian Group were filed as third-party consulting services, the line items vague enough to pass a surface review, the paperwork structured to look legitimate from above. Total received from Meridian project accounts over 8 months, $4,200,000. Every single disbursement approved by Xavier Grant. Clearfield's registered address, when she traced it to the holding entity, turned out to be the home address of Xavier's brother's wife in Evanston. "Every internal reporting channel runs through the CFO's office," Grace said. "If you submit through any official pathway, Xavier will know before the document reaches Eleanor." Logan sat with this for a moment. "Then I have to go directly to her." Grace nodded. They both understood what that meant and what it would require. Grace reached into her desk and produced a sealed envelope containing printed records of all 14 transactions, with cross-reference annotations linking each disbursement to the specific approval records. She put it on the table between them. "I can't put my name on this," she said, "but you can use it." Logan took the envelope. They shook hands without ceremony. He left. The next morning, Logan received a calendar invitation that had not come from his own account. A meeting with the HR director at 10. When he arrived and sat down, the director placed a printed document on the desk between them with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message they did not write and have not been authorized to explain or defend. The document was a formal internal complaint. It alleged that Logan Hayes had approached the CEO outside of established organizational protocol on multiple occasions, conducted himself in a manner inconsistent with professional standards, and created what it called a pattern of inappropriate engagement with senior leadership. There was no named complainant. There were no specific incidents with verifiable dates and witnesses. The language was precise enough to be legally legible and vague enough to make any direct response functionally impossible. Logan read through every paragraph and set it down and looked up. "Who submitted this? We're not able to share that at this stage of the process." He nodded once and stood up without another word. He was not angry in any way that showed. He was something that lived below anger, a cold and specific clarity, the state of a person who has finished making a decision and is now simply operating inside it. In the hallway, Grace was 50 feet away. She read his face in the time it takes to draw a breath. He shook his head once, very small. She stayed where she was. He walked past her and they said nothing to each other, which communicated exactly what needed to be communicated. Eleanor received the documentation from Xavier that same afternoon. It had been assembled with genuine skill, a narrative account of professional boundary violations supported by staff observations written with careful ambiguity, 2 pages of corroborating documentation that stopped short of explicit accusation, and a final section carrying a specific recommendation for formal review. Xavier sat across from her and delivered it in the measured, regretful voice of someone performing a difficult duty they did not seek. He said he had a responsibility to protect her. He said the team respected her working relationship with Hayes, but that the documentation spoke for itself. Eleanor read from the first page to the last without interrupting. When she turned the final page, she looked at Xavier's face. There was something specific in the arrangement of his expression. A tension around the eyes that did not match the performed reluctance in his voice, something held in place by ongoing effort, as if the mask had a weight to it that required active maintenance. She had nothing in her hands that contradicted what he had put on her desk. The documentation was internally coherent. The process had its own institutional logic. She signed the temporary review order because that was what the documentation required of her. When Xavier left, she sat alone in the office and, without fully understanding the reason, she opened her phone and looked at the photograph Jason had sent her 2 weeks earlier. Logan at the 19th floor window, hand extended toward the framework, explaining something. She had not deleted it. She looked at it for a while. Then she placed the phone face down on the desk. At 9:45 that evening, Logan returned to the Meridian building. His access card no longer reached the executive floors. He tried the main elevator bank first, as a matter of form. The panel responded without comment, simply refusing to register the 28th floor as an available destination. He went back to the lobby and stood near the marble column at the center of the space, working through the problem with the same patience he brought to a structural calculation that had not resolved yet. He had been there perhaps 4 minutes when he heard footsteps coming from the east corridor and turned to find Jason Cole crossing the lobby with the same overfull stack of folders he seemed always to be managing. The same composed, slightly forward lean of a person carrying more than any single person should reasonably be asked to carry, doing it without complaint, which Logan had noted the first time he saw it, and which he had thought about intermittently since. Jason stopped when he registered who was standing at the column. He looked at the envelope in Logan's hand. He did not look surprised, which was interesting. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone running a calculation that has more than one variable and is not in a hurry to get to the wrong answer. Then he said, "I can't help you with that." He paused. "The service elevator on level B2 runs on a guest access key. The code is the founding year of the original Meridian building." He did not look at Logan again. He turned and walked toward the interior stairwell and pushed through the door without slowing his pace or looking back. Logan stood in the lobby for a moment, looking at the stairwell door that had just closed. He was thinking about the first time he had held an elevator for Jason without any particular reason. the small, unremarkable gesture of one person noticing that another person's hands were full and doing something about it. He found the service elevator. The code was 1947. The car delivered him to the executive corridor on the 28th floor, and he walked its full length to the door, where the light was still on at nearly 10 at night. He knocked once and opened it. Eleanor was at her desk with a cold cup of coffee and an open project file, and she looked up and her expression moved through several stages in quick succession: recognition, the practiced hardening of her professional default, and then something that came after the professionalism and lived in considerably quieter territory. "You don't have authorization to be here. I know." He crossed to her desk and set the envelope down the way he placed a technical instrument, with precision, without drama, without the posture of a man appealing for anything. He looked at her directly. "I'm not here about my job." She looked at the envelope. "Meridian Tower will be handed over to approximately 22,000 daily users when this project completes. The man signing the financial approvals for the structural phase has been redirecting $4 million through a Delaware shell company for 8 months. On top of lobbying to reduce the verification standards on the building, those people are going to live and work inside." She picked up the envelope. She opened it. She read the first page carefully, then the second. Then she went back to the first and read it again. Logan turned to look out the window. Below, the city was operating at its ordinary late-night register. Not dramatic, not quiet, simply the enormous, unremarkable machinery of a working city moving through the hours. He listened to the sound of pages turning and then the sound of pages not turning for a very long time. He turned back. Eleanor had placed both hands flat on the desk on either side of the document, and she was completely still. For the first time in the entirety of their acquaintance, there was no performance layer on her face. The precision and intelligence were fully present. They were always present, they were fundamental to how she was built. But the composed executive presentation was gone, and what was left was a woman sitting in an empty building late at night who had just understood, at full resolution and with no room for reinterpretation, what the trust she had placed most completely had actually been used for. Logan saw it. He did not speak to it. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Stay." 2 words. Even, unhurried. Not a command, not a request. Something between the two, which is where the most honest things tend to sit when they are finally said. Logan stopped at the doorframe. He turned back around. Eleanor sent the board meeting notice at 7 the following morning. Jason had it out through the standard system inside 12 minutes. 12 board members arrived at 9. Xavier came in at 9:02 with his customary untroubled ease, took his usual seat, and arranged his materials in the practiced manner of a man who has spent 2 decades on the comfortable side of consequential tables and sees no reason to expect this morning will be different. Eleanor was already standing at the head of the room. She placed the document package in front of her, did not set up a presentation, and began reading directly from the material in the flat, sequential voice she used for technical documentation. 14 transactions. $4,200,000 over 8 months. Clearfield Subholdings incorporated 9 months and 3 weeks before the first payment arrived, documented as third-party consulting services on every invoice, excluded from quarterly audit scope by specific standing directive from the CFO, every approval signed by Xavier Grant. When she had read the last figure, she set the pages down and looked at him across the table. "Xavier, Clearfield Subholdings. Where is it registered and who is the actual operating officer?" He held her gaze for the precise duration it took him to understand that she had already independently confirmed the answer before asking the question. "This is a manufactured narrative," he said, and his voice was still controlled, still credible. "Hayes created unauthorized access to your office to deliver fabricated documentation designed specifically to implicate. Clearfield is registered in Delaware," Eleanor said. "The holding entity's sole registered officer is your brother. The listed operating address is the home address of your sister-in-law in Evanston." The room was completely silent. Xavier looked around the table, not seeking support, but in the involuntary way of a person whose calculations have just encountered a variable that cannot be accommodated. 2 board members had their eyes on the table's surface. 3 were watching Eleanor with the fixed attention of people who have already updated their position and are waiting for the formal process to arrive at the same conclusion. Xavier opened his mouth again. Eleanor said, 14 transfers, in 8 months. Is a coincidence. It was not a question. It was a statement that had been tested and had held and required no further support. The board voted to place Xavier on immediate administrative suspension before the meeting formally concluded. He walked out of the building at 11:22, moving at pace through the lobby, not looking at the reception desk or or the elevator banks, or the people who watched him make his way across the marble floor. The revolving door turned. He was gone. By 4 that afternoon, the independent audit had been formally engaged through an outside firm. The internal staff notification had gone out under Jason's signature on Eleanor's authority, and Logan's full credentials had been reinstated without comment or ceremony. The reinstatement notice itself was a single printed page, functional and plain, carrying less language than the suspension notice had. Logan read it once and folded it and put it in the outer pocket of his bag, and he did not think about the way the past 2 weeks had gone, or about what the next few weeks would ask of the company, or about what would now happen to the documents he had assembled. He thought briefly about Grace, who had handed him the envelope in a parking structure and told him to go, and about the particular quality of trust it required to do that, to hand someone else the thing you had found and step back and let them carry it. He would find a way to say something to her about that later. Not in any elaborate way, just in the way you acknowledge a thing that was done well and that mattered. Grace was already in the corridor near the elevator banks when he arrived, leaning against the wall with her arms folded, saying nothing out loud but communicating a considerable amount through her overall posture. His reinstatement notice was 1 page, functional and plain. He folded it and put it in the outer pocket of his bag. Several people from the structural team were nearby in the corridor, not assembled deliberately, just the natural accumulation of people at the end of a long day who had not quite decided to leave yet. Adrian Walsh, a junior engineer 2 years out of school who had a reliable and sometimes inconvenient habit of saying the thing the room had quietly agreed not to address, looked down the length of the corridor at the warm line of light still showing under Eleanor's closed office door, then looked back at the group. Can we acknowledge that she went through the entire board by herself this morning, and nobody in this building has ever once thought to ask her to dinner? Grace looked at Logan, not with instruction. Simply the way a person looks at someone they have known a long time when something specific is approaching, and they want to see it from the correct angle. Logan was quiet for a moment. He looked down the corridor at Eleanor's door, at the thin horizontal line of warm light at the base of it. Then he looked back at the group, and with the quiet ease of a man who has learned to use understated humor as a way of saying things he has not quite decided to say directly, he said, "Whoever's with her is a lucky guy." The group gave the easy, relieved laugh of people releasing the accumulated pressure of a very long shared day. Logan turned back toward the elevator. He did not see the door at the far end of the corridor. Jason saw it. He had been standing near the supply room, and he went very still the moment he heard it open. The footsteps that followed were unhurried and clear on the polished stone floor. The people near the elevator began to register the sound before they had turned to confirm what it was. Eleanor Voss came down the corridor with her jacket over one arm and her expression simply at rest. Nothing managed in it, nothing performed for the hallway. She stopped 3 steps away from Logan, who had heard her, and turned. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the first morning he said a true thing in a room full of carefully maintained partial truths, and she did not look at anyone else in that corridor. Was hoping that would be you. 7 words, spoken at an even pace, without the self-protective qualification that almost any person in her position would have instinctively reached for. The kind of sentence that has been inside someone for a period of time and has finally arrived at the only moment that will fit it. The corridor was very quiet. Grace did not move. Adrian Walsh appeared to stop functioning entirely. Jason studied the floor with the private expression of someone who has been aware of something longer than it was his place to speak. Logan did not look away from her. He did not reach for a deflection, did not arrange his face into anything neutral, and did not do the thing he had been doing, in one form or another, for 4 years, which was finding the fastest available exit from any moment that asked too much of him. He stayed in it. The 2 of them stood in that corridor, and the light was the low amber of late autumn at the end of a day that had required a great deal from both of them, and Chicago was making its ordinary sounds below, and Logan Hayes stood entirely still and let Eleanor Voss look at him and looked back at her without reaching for anything to put between them. She adjusted the jacket on her arm. "Do you want to walk?" Not weighted, not structured around implication. The question of someone who has spent a long enclosed day and has decided they want air and movement and has noticed, without making a formal policy of it, that they would prefer not to walk alone. Logan took his jacket from his bag and put it on. He followed her to the elevator. Behind them, Grace caught Jason's eye across the corridor. Neither spoke. The expression between them was entirely adequate. They walked south along the river, the city working at its usual full November volume around them, the cold water carrying the reflected glow of the skyline in broken pieces. They did not talk about the audit or Xavier or the board, or what the next several weeks would require of either of them. Eleanor asked how long he had been in Chicago, 11 years. She asked what had originally brought him. He said a project offer, and the fact that Chicago's infrastructure had always seemed to him like a problem worth a very long time. She accepted this as a complete answer because it was one. After a while he said, without a great deal of introduction, "I'm not particularly good at things like this." He left the category undefined. She looked at the water. "Neither am I," she said quietly. "I'm honestly not certain I could define what things like this means." They walked on. A barge moved south on the river, its running lights reflected in orange lines on the black water. At a low pedestrian bridge crossing a side channel, Logan slowed and stopped. He put his hands in his pockets. Out of long-standing reflex, he took out his wallet, not for any specific reason, simply the way people touch familiar objects in moments of stillness, and Eleanor was standing close enough that she saw the photograph inside before he registered that she was looking. A woman with light-colored hair, laughing at whoever was holding the camera, her face entirely unguarded and entirely present. Logan saw her see it. He did not close the wallet quickly. "She died 4 years ago," he said. Plain, available, without any additional framing. Emma was 4. Eleanor looked at the photograph for a moment and then at the river. She said, "She chose the right person." Logan was quiet for a considerable time. The barge had moved out from under the frame of the bridge. "I hope so," he said. He put the wallet back in his jacket pocket. They stood at the railing for another minute or two, the cold coming steadily off the lake, the way it did in November, working its way through every available opening in the city, patient and impartial. They said goodnight at the corner where the Riverwalk met the main street, without any ceremony to it. Eleanor said, "Tomorrow I need you back on site. The 19th floor still has 2 weld points that haven't been corrected." Logan said, "I flagged them 10 days ago." She looked at him and something moved in her expression, slow, genuine, a smile that arrived without being sent for and did not close down immediately the way her managed expressions always did, the way she had trained herself to let them. She turned and walked toward her car. Logan stood on the pavement for a moment and then walked in the other direction. He had covered about a block when he stopped and took out his phone and found Grace's number and typed, "I don't think I'm going to keep saying no to things." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking. The phone buzzed once. He looked. Finally, he kept walking. The cold off the lake moved through the city the way it always did in November, through every gap between the buildings, steady and without opinion. And Logan Hayes walked into it the same way he had always walked into things. Without announcement, without ceremony, simply moving forward into the actual structure of what was coming next, and trusting that what had been built honestly would hold. Logan Hayes had spent 4 years constructing things for other people to stand inside. Buildings engineered to carry weight across decades, designed to absorb whatever the ordinary force of time and use and weather required of them. He understood, professionally, the difference between a material that had been compromised from the start and a design that was sound and simply needed the right conditions to prove what it was. He had been applying something like that same analysis, mostly without recognizing it, to the rest of his life, keeping his own weight carefully off anything that might not hold, staying at the edges of rooms that asked too much, moving through the years with the practiced independence of a man who had decided, without quite stating it, that the safest structure was the one you occupied alone. It had taken him considerably longer than it should have to understand that this was not engineering. It was a habit that had been wearing the clothing of judgment for 4 years, and it had been doing it well enough that he had not noticed the difference. The man who could read every building had needed one specific evening, in one specific corridor lit by the quiet gold of late autumn, to finally apply to himself the thing he had understood about structures from the beginning. What holds over time is never the distance you maintain from real weight. It is the decision, made quietly, without ceremony, without waiting for the load calculations to guarantee the outcome, to trust the thing you have been building with everything you actually are.